Hello and welcome to today's Roundtable, Debating Diagnostic Criteria for Autism, featuring Catherine Lord, Sally Rogers and David Skuse. I'm Claire Cameron, Engagement Editor at Spectrum, the home for autism research news and analysis. We'll begin the roundtable in a moment, but first, know that we'll be fielding questions at the end of today's presentation, but you can ask them at any point during the session. To ask a question, submit them via the chat window to the left of your screen. And as always, I'll note that if there are any members of the press tuning in, you can only report information presented during this debate if that material has already been published elsewhere, or if you have first obtained express written permission from the panelists. Released in May 2013, the DSM-5 was a long-awaited update to the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Known as Psychiatry's Bible in the US, the DSM outlines diagnostic criteria for various mental conditions. The update redefined autism, combining 4 independent diagnoses into one. It also combined social and language deficits into a single measure, which meant that to be diagnosed with autism, an individual must have deficits in social communication and social interaction and show restrictive, repetitive behavior. Although there were concerns over the new criteria, many more think the update has helped move the field forward. 5 years on, we have gathered together 3 autism researchers to debate the utility of the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria. Joining us today are Catherine Lord, Sally Rogers, and David Skuse. Catherine Lord is a professor of psychology and psychiatry and director of the Center for Autism and the Developing Brain at Weill Cornell Medical Center in New York. Sally Rogers is a professor of psychiatry at the University of California Davis Mind Institute. And David Skuse is a professor of behavioral and brain sciences at the University College London in the UK. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
I'd just like to open the field by asking, how has the DSM-5 made it easier to diagnose autism, and for whom? College London in the UK. Thank you all for joining us. I'd just like to open the field by asking, how has the DSM-5 made it easier to diagnose autism, and for whom?
Should we plunge in here?
Plunge in, Kathy.
So I think the hope was that it would make it easier for everybody. So easier for families to get a sense of what autism spectrum disorder means, easier for providers and easier for researchers. And the idea was to have a more sensible number of core features that overlapped a little bit less, be able to recognize how different autism is across people by identifying the core features, but leave it up to the individual, that is the families, the people with autism, and the providers to come up with examples. So in the original DSM, it was somewhat mixed up whether what was listed were examples of the behaviors or the features. And so in DSM-5, what we wanted to do was actually list the features and then have the providers and the families and the person with autism try to provide examples of the features that were like social communication deficits. So we hope that would be clearer. And then another thing we wanted to do was say, these are the features that define autism, and then these other things can occur along with it. For example, a language delay, or ADHD, or a genetic disorder, or intellectual disability. And those other things don't prevent autism. They can occur with it, or they cannot. And so try to make it clear that you can have an ASD or an autism spectrum disorder with something or without it. So I think those are some of the things we were trying to do to make it better.
I think one of the biggest contributions has been bringing together the various diagnoses that were being used without much consistency across different agencies or different countries. I think having the diagnoses of pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, and Asperger's syndrome, and autism altogether were making it so confusing for families, for clinicians, for service agencies in terms of who was to be covered according to different laws. I think that it really created a lot of problems for families and service coordinators. And I think recognizing that the data were very clear that these were not different disorders, that they all belonged under a bigger, wider umbrella, and that we tried to capture that umbrella by giving examples from the most severe and the least severe in each of the main features. I feel like that was a tremendous improvement on what was going on, and also a big help for diagnosticians and families, although of course there was plenty of debate about that decision.
I think that one of the most important changes from DSM-4, from our perspective, is the recognition that autism is common among people who don't have an intellectual disability. And the DSM-5 criteria have been adjusted over the DSM-4 criteria to take that into account. So I think that they make a lot of clinical sense for helping us clinicians diagnose people who have an autism spectrum disorder, but normal or high intellectual abilities, without any formal disorder of language. I think the removal of the criterion language delay was important. And I think that of course, the removal of those prescriptive rules that said you couldn't have certain comorbidities with an autism spectrum disorder is also very important from the point of view of clinical management. For example, it really made no sense to be treating ADHD, but not able to diagnose it in somebody who had an autism spectrum disorder.
And in some ways that narrowed the diagnosis somewhat, because before, when there were no other diagnoses that were legitimately allowed, it was creating this very large group of people with autism, and the idea that many of the comorbidities were actually part of the disorder, that ADHD was part of the disorder, that severe aggressive or oppositional behavior was part of the disorder, because it required us to use the same kind of diagnostic umbrella with all of these. It also prevented treatment. You got into situations where a child couldn't be referred to ADHD clinic if they had autism because it wasn't diagnosed. So I feel like by getting the comorbidities properly placed within the disorders that refer to those particular symptoms, now it's clear that autism doesn't always come with severe behavior problems, self-abuse, even some kinds of stereotypies. And so it allows for a clearer eye in terms of looking at the symptoms that occur and thinking about the treatments that are appropriate for those symptoms, rather than just being limited to the treatments for autism.
Agreed.
Do you think that in that sense then the DSM-5 has allowed us to think of autism more transdiagnostically rather than as something with the sort of set criteria that a person has to meet?
We hope so. I think that the intention initially in DSM-5 was to try to have more continuous dimensions, and the idea that people really don't, we aren't boxes where we pop out and we fit into a diagnosis. And, the reality is that diagnoses are really labels of convenience that allow us to identify other people who have similar problems. They allow us to get services. They allow us to get information about what is going awry or what might help us. But it's not, we can all place ourselves on continua all the time about all sorts of things. And so, but I think we have to have some kind of label at any given time, often, to access information or to decide who gets what. And so I think that it's always a complicated decision where we fall in terms of who's in and who's out. But I think we hoped that we could provide reasonable ways of making that decision and be relatively transparent about how that is made, and hope that families would understand that and individuals with ASD would understand that and be able to use that information also across time as people are changing, as kids are growing up, and that's changing too. So I hope that the transparency is clearer too.
I think that there is a recognition in DSM-5, which is enormously important, which is that the symptom complex may not become obvious until social demands exceed that individual's capacity to cope. And that's so important when we're thinking about, for example, the diagnosis in girls, which may be a topic we want to discuss later, but particularly bright girls can manage often until adolescence, and then their social world collapses because the social demands in adolescence exceed their capacity to cope. And it becomes clear in retrospect when one interviews them and their parents that these difficulties have actually existed for many years, but they've been disguised. But I think what is very insightful of DSM-5 is that it acknowledges that can be the case. You do not have to make a diagnosis before the age of 4 years, for example.
Mm-hmm.
One question that we did have from an audience member who wrote in, and I'm going to ask it now because it really is sort of touching on this topic, is whether or not there maybe needs to be some rethinking of the criteria for children and adults, if it needs to be more a breakdown of the criteria so for things that are specifically for adults who might have been missed in childhood, and then more specificity for children, especially girls on the spectrum.
Well, I think that what we've tried to do, but I think we're learning more about girls all the time, because the reality is we don't have as much information about girls because there have been so many more boys studied than girls. And so as we get more information about girls and get more research about girls, we can have better information that can come back into the criteria. And that will help, I think. But I think that I hope we set up a structure into which we put that information, particularly for girls. I think that's probably true also for ages. I mean, we don't, at this point, we haven't figured out, for example, what babies with autism looks like. Nobody's really figured out for sure how to diagnose autism in tiny babies. We can't do it right now. We have a sense of how it develops mostly in kids, between 1 year and 2 years, but we're still missing it often. And I think David's point is, for some kids, the reason we're missing it is they're doing well. They're compensating. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. We're missing it because other things, good things are going on. And so I think that we have to realize that we're all a combination as individuals of trajectories of behaviors that are strong and behaviors that aren't as strong. And we need to have a sense that many things are going on all at the same time. And so I don't know that we'll ever have a criteria that will describe all of those things all at once, but parents need to be attuned to what is happening well and what is not necessarily happening as well. And then I think what we did do in DSM-5 is eliminate an absolute cutoff, which says, boy, if you aren't this by that, you do not have ASD. We really tried to say that is no longer the case.
Mm-hmm. To the other panelists, I don't know how we get around the kind of circularity that we have in terms of the diagnosis, and the criteria are largely based on the symptoms that boys demonstrate. That's how autism was first identified, that it's mostly boys and males who are in the standardization groups. We've used boys and males to kind of carve and define the diagnoses. And now we're saying, well, why are we missing girls? But we're missing girls perhaps because, they may present with somewhat different disorder, and we may be trying to apply a set of criteria developed in one group to another group of people. And yes, they don't meet criteria that are built around boys' symptoms, but I don't know how we get past that.
Well, I would agree. In part, I think that the social communication, social reciprocity dimension is pretty similar in girls, actually. It's hard to think of any particular facet of that would distinguish the groups, at least in our experience. But I think in terms of the repetitive and stereotype behaviors and that domain, then that becomes more tricky, because those are very largely based on a male stereotype, as you've said, Sally. And I think that's particularly an issue in DSM-5, which we've tried to rectify to some degree, I think not wholly successfully, in the criteria for the International Classification of Disease 11th revision, which will be published later this year. And our criteria for autism will follow pretty closely the DSM-5, but we have tried to modify those criteria to make them more broadly applicable to both sexes. I think this is something that Kathy's got some thoughts about as well. The RRSB, repetitive and stereotype behaviors of the DSM-5, had a few problems, I think. Kathy, is that right?
Yeah, I think that's really true. I mean, I think that, you know, all of us, and, you know, Sally was there too at DSM-5, you know, we had this really grab bag of repetitive behaviors, and we're all trying to figure out how do we organize this really very different group of behaviors, which include these sensory anomalies, which I think we all feel like are there, but we have very little research and a lot of self-reports and observations about, but we don't quite know what they are. You know, we have observations of often small children or people with severe intellectual disabilities doing motoric things or things with objects or things with their bodies. We have preoccupations, we have strong interest in things, often things that we do tie with boys, or things that overlap with many people, like obsessions with video games, which are very hard to know quite what to do with. You know, and so, and then we have obscure things like being obsessed with another person, which is quite hard, I think, to know quite what to do with. And then we have rigidity, which I think is what, you know, which is very hard to define, but I think is a major source of, and difficulty adapting, which I think is a major source of difficulty for many people with ASD, and sort of more executive functioning kinds of problems or organizational problems, where the specificity of that kind of problem is very hard to justify, but it's a major source of difficulty. So I think just having seen recently the ICD-11 proposals, I think it is going to move us forward from where we were in DSM-5. But literally, I think in DSM-5, you know, it was a complete compromise among a group of 15 experts. You know, I'll trade you motor for this, because everyone had an opinion. No, you know, we could not justify our opinions with data, you know, because you could slice up this pie in a million different directions. And it is, you know, we don't know how to do this. We don't know.
Well, and part of the problem is that unlike the primary social reciprocity deficit, the repetitive movements are not specific to ASD. I don't think there's a single one of them that only occurs in ASD. So unlike the first characteristic, we're talking about a second set of characteristics that can occur in a very wide range of people, including people who don't have any disability. And it's because they occur in combination with the problems in social reciprocity that they become part of the ASD. It's only about the combination, in my mind. It's not about the specific type of repetitive behavior.
Right.
Or rigidity. I don't know if you both see it the same way.
So we have so much to learn, I think, about what those behaviors are. And I think the sex differences are right in there in terms of confounding them. And I think issues related to intellectual disability, because these differences change over time and are very related to intellectual disability in terms of who does what when. So there's a lot we need to do.
So I think that the measurement of executive function deficits in in people with autism, Kathy, is a huge challenge. We don't have, I mean, of course, the use of that term as being meaningful anyway, but let's say that at least we can agree that there are some components to do with cognitive rigidity and planning ability and adaptation to change and so on, which seem to reflect what we broadly call executive functions. But how to measure those in people with an autism spectrum disorder, I think is something that requires a major major piece of research, and that hasn't been done yet, to the best of my knowledge.
And in terms of executive function, it's really a characteristic that's typically applied to people within the normal intellectual range. I mean, once you bring intellectual disability into it, then executive function is part of the difficulty within intellectual disability. So we're talking about executive function, I think, primarily in the subgroup of people with ASD who don't also have significant cognitive deficits.
Yes. And that raises an interesting question, which Kathy asked me about recently, which was what evidence do we have for the profile in terms of intellectual disability of people who are being diagnosed nowadays? Because there's been a massive change over the last 10 or certainly since DSM-4 came out 20 years. And interestingly enough, in the UK, I discovered that there are data collected by the Department of Education which suggests that as many as nearly 90% of children who've been diagnosed with autism and are receiving support in our schools in England do not have a significant degree of generalized intellectual disability.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I think the reason David and I were talking about it is just that the proportions of people with intellectual disability and autism reported are so variable across country and across different clinics and in different circumstances. And it's almost impossible to interpret data without knowing where those data come from, because if you're talking about a low resource country or a clinic that serves primarily individuals with intellectual disability and autism, that's a very, very different group of people than, the group that David's talking about. And often that is not clear to people at all. And so it makes things very hard. It also makes things hard for parents, I think, who have a 2-year-old or 3-year-old with autism and don't know, is my child a child with autism and an intellectual disability? And as a provider of those kids, we don't know either. And so it's complicated. And even as that child is 3 or 4, we don't necessarily know for sure. And that is a real point of, when do you decide and what do you decide and what happens there? Which I think we generally don't talk about very much.
Mm-hmm. It seems to me like, just from my clinical experience, that there's a reticence among some psychologists, at least, about co-diagnosing intellectual disability and ASD in children, that once an ASD diagnosis is made, especially in early childhood, when the delays, when developmental delays are a common part of the ASD picture, that as that child gets older, 3, 4, 5, and it's very clear that the developmental delays are global and they're going to be there forever, that's not fair. They're at least present now and they are a significant part of the child's disability, that the autism diagnosis often overrides calling the intellectual disability. And there's, I just run into so many parents whose children are 8 or 9, and for the first time, someone's naming intellectual disability as a second diagnosis. And they're asking why? Why didn't anybody say this beforehand? And the data were clear beforehand, but I think sometimes it may be more difficult for clinicians to talk about intellectual disability than it is to talk about ASD. And so we hold back on the second diagnosis, when in reality it would be helpful for parents to know that there is a second major difficulty going on, that it helps explain less progress in treatment than other children might make, for instance. I hope that we become more comfortable with making multiple diagnoses when it's appropriate in children, particularly children who are under the age of 8 or 10.
Mm.
I think that this gets to another sort of important issue that we can go on to now, is the issue of comorbidities, and the fact that a lot of people do have these second diagnoses, and how that sort of comes into the autism diagnosis and the problem of diagnostic overshadowing.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a very important issue. As I said, the issue of comorbidity is increasingly recognised, and strangely enough, we've only noticed in recent years how common it is for people with autism to have high levels of anxiety. Mm-hmm. I plotted out the number of papers published on comorbid anxiety and ASD for the last 20 years for my own amusement. And for lecturing purposes, and it's extraordinary. It's an exponential curve. The number of papers in the last, say, 5 years would exceed every year before that by a multiple of 10, I should think. So it's something people are writing about now. It must always have been there. I'm perplexed as to why we didn't realize how important it was clinically before now. But certainly my experience is that intense anxiety can exacerbate symptoms of autism, and indeed, if one can treat them effectively, one can ameliorate the symptoms of autism without treating with autism, as it were, the core social communication problems, at all. But I'd be interested to hear your experiences.
I mean, that actually, go ahead, Sally.
No, I want to hear what you're going to say.
Well, I was going to say, I think that's a really good point. And I mean, I feel a little guilty about that, but because, as one of the producers of the ADOS as a diagnostic instrument, I think that in the schools here in the US, a lot of the assessments are focused on autism, and school psychologists, get a child referred for autism, and they immediately think, oh, I'm going to give them an ADOS, and that's the end. And it should just be the beginning, because a lot of the problems that are occurring are not, I mean, they may be related to autism, but they also may be related to things like anxiety. And I was just kind of horrified recently where someone was telling me about how a child had been referred to a team, and they had, brought the child in, interviewed the parent, and then they thought, oh, they might have autism. So what did they do? They bring the child back in and did an ADOS, and the child was so anxious they couldn't do an ADOS. And I was like, oh my goodness, what are you doing? And they were like, so, I mean, they should have been thinking, why are you doing this ADOS? Because if the child is this anxious, that you should be worrying about how anxious he is, not so much why he can't do an ADOS. So my point is just that the anxiety is as important as the autism features. And I think that sometimes gets lost in the, let me fill out this form or do this test. I think that it is, but we now officially, at least with DSM-5, you have the permission to say, I should be thinking about all of this, and that we are talking about real people here, and who can have multiple problems. And, obviously anxiety and autism can work together to make things harder if you have a child who doesn't know how to behave, or is feeling socially at a loss, who wants friends but doesn't know how to make them, and gets increasingly anxious because of that. So you want to take into account the features of autism in addressing the anxiety and back and forth. But I do think, that we need to think about all of them. Then obviously language has a component as well, because I think often you have kids who don't understand as much language as much as we might think, and people don't realize that, and they don't bother to really fully assess a child's language skills as well as they might.
Mhm. I have a couple of points related to this. I think in this discussion of anxiety or autism, I think it's important that we all remember that these boundaries are social constructs that we've all written in the DSM-5. They're agreements, and that in the brain, there are no like straight lines that divide an anxiety part from an autism part. Much of the genetic data and imaging data show overlap at the biological levels. David, you're the one who can correct me here for any mistakes I made, but I understand that there are not boundaries between these. And in fact, some of the reason for the comorbidity is because of shared biological processes. So that was one point I wanted to make. And the second one I wanted to make was, as we open up these boundaries and allow for comorbid diagnoses, then it becomes a challenge when Kathy's talking about bringing out other assessments. Now it's a matter of how do you use the norms for other assessments? Because if you've got a child with ASD and the child also has a developmental delay, I'm thinking of a child we've seen recently, child has significant cognitive delays, the child has significant autism, and the child has behavior problems. And so now we bring out a measure to look at the behavior problems. And what are the norms that we use for this? Do we use the chronological age norms for this nonverbal child who's functioning many years behind their age? Do we use developmental age? How do we make decisions about cutoffs in these other areas? It's really complicated.
And so I think that relates to another issue that we were going to debate, which was functional impairment.
Mhm.
I think that's really the key. We want to think what do we need to enable this child to function better within the context of their family and their school. I think rather than a focus of are they over a threshold for a particular disorder. I'd be interested in your comments on that, Kathy.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line for DSM-5 was supposed to be that to have a diagnosis, you're supposed to have a functional impairment, meaning that you're supposed to need help for something. And I think people often ask, well, what on earth does that mean? What is a functional impairment? And I think, it's easier, I think, if you're talking about someone who's had a stroke or someone, to say, well, you need help washing your hands or walking. But I think it is, it does mean you need help doing something ordinary. But I think it is also fair to say, would you like help? If someone is feeling that everything is absolutely fine, then I think that we're not going around looking to label somebody whose life is okay. We are looking for people that are seeking help, or families that are seeking help for their children. And I think that is different from somebody who is just quirky or has their own way of doing something, and that gets complicated, and that is part of the reason why we sort of moved away from the Asperger's term, because it got so murky of what is just a different condition versus a different way of thinking about the world from something that really is something where it, as a society, we feel like this society is going to invest funds to support this difference because it really is a disorder. And I think that probably we may not all the three of us, I mean, David and Sally, you should jump in too. We may not all agree exactly where is the line of what is an impairment or where should we help. But I think my bias, partly because I spend so much time with families and individuals who do need help. And it's not all desperate help, and it's not all help that you would need, it would jump out at you at all, but it is help, it is people that could do better, who could accomplish more, who could be happier, and who could be more independent. I think that's important. And it's people who have strengths. There's no doubt people who have strengths and things to contribute. Mostly I work with children, and mostly I see these children as being able to do much, much more, and really have a place in this world. But we want to make sure that they can have this place and not let them down because we haven't given them this grain of help. And that's where I see the functional impairment as necessary to recognize.
Kathy, do you think the use of standardized adaptive behavior measures is an appropriate way to document the functional needs enough to make that diagnosis?
Sometimes it's just that is dependent on somebody reporting those, and so I think that it is dependent on a parent or a teacher reporting. And, we know that sometimes people are overly optimistic, or people forget how much they do for somebody. So I think that we have to have a variety of different ways of getting that information. I think partly because I am sort of a measurement person, I'm very aware that, you can use a measurement tool to get almost anything. And so I would never say use one tool. I would say it should be, you should be able to use a variety of different tools depending on what you're trying to accomplish.
I think that's something that is acknowledged by DSM-5, which wasn't acknowledged previously, the dimensionality of the diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
That there isn't a separate subgroup of people who are autistic, as it were, and then the rest of us are neurotypical. There is a dimensionality and multi-dimensionality, and we have to take that into account when we're figuring out how to help people. And I think that certainly in the majority of children I see, which are largely children of school age, so it's a little different to the population maybe that Sally sees. The key issue is, if they got more support because they had a diagnosis, that is going to help them achieve more in their lives, and it's going to help people understand some of their quirkiness. So again, bearing in mind that there is some fuzzy line over which you say, well, the diagnosis is appropriate, and one obviously has to take that into account as well. It isn't just a matter of how functionally impaired they are, but the combination of the two things, mm-hmm. I think and the issue of resources is something we haven't really discussed, but is clearly something that has influenced the development of DSM-5, I guess, the American medical system and the way that it reimburses for a diagnosis.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
I think that this is a good point to jump in and say that we're going to turn it over to questions because we have a lot of questions from the audience today. And actually, one of the things, just sort of coming off of what you were saying just now, one audience member says that they feel like moving away from the Asperger's diagnosis is actually a mistake because it detracts from the needs that people with the diagnosis had, and instead being lumped into the autism diagnosis has actually had a negative effect on how people think about their ability to function.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that's the case. There's no commonality, I think, of reactions to this. Some people with Asperger's syndrome, we had people with Asperger's syndrome advising us on the DSM-5 committee, and they were quite positive about this because they felt that they had been separated from services because they didn't meet autism, weren't seen as having autism, and were seen as being too skilled for services. So many people with Asperger's felt like this was a positive, as well as other people seeing that this removed something that was an important separate identity. For us on the committee, I defer to Kathy on this, but I guess for myself, it was important that people who had functional disability be recognized for the needs that they had for supports. And that was a reason to, and also to understand this continuum of symptoms from people without symptoms into people with the most severe symptoms, and the idea that there are no discrete cutoffs here, that this is a wide continuum, and some people are severely affected by this in terms of everyday life, and some folks function fine in everyday life and still have these characteristics as a kind of a style of being. I don't have a great word for this, but state versus trait is an old-fashioned way to think about this. So I have great sympathy for people who feel that they were hurt by this, but I want them to know that we got a lot of input around this from people with Asperger's syndrome and family members around what they saw as the best decision and a very difficult decision to make.
Yeah, I think that we, I think that we are concerned about people who felt very attached to the term Asperger's. And I think that people still can use the term if they want to. I think my greatest concern about it was that when we actually looked at how people used the term, it was so variable. One of the things that happened was when we first published online the fact that we were going to probably merge the term with ASD, we got huge influx of comments saying you can't do that because I know what Asperger's is. And then what people knew Asperger's were hundreds of different things. I mean, people said, my brother is a pilot, he has Asperger's, or my child is nonverbal, he has Asperger's, or, I mean, it was just a list of thousands of different things. And in fact, when we looked at the research, what we found, even in a very well-conducted study, we had 13 sites. The best predictor of Asperger's, besides higher IQ, was which site you were diagnosed. Not any characteristic of you other than a higher IQ, but where you had a diagnosis. And we really shouldn't have medical terminology that is determined by who diagnoses you. Although we know that happens in other kinds of diagnosis. That should not be going on. And actually, when we looked at those sites, each site had a different way of diagnosing Asperger's. So there was a Yale diagnosis of Asperger, which was very consistent. And there was a Christopher Gilbert diagnosis of Asperger, and a Lorna Wing diagnosis of Asperger, and a Digby Tatum diagnosis of Asperger. And all of those are very reputable people who have their own diagnosis of Asperger. But they were all different. So this is not good, you guys. And so we felt like this does not help anybody. And so we had to move back to say, what are they actually talking about? And what they're talking about is variations in intellectual ability, in language ability, in social deficits. And those are the things that we thought, that's what people should be talking about. We should talk about ASD with or without language deficits, with or without intellectual disability, with more or less severe social deficits. But I think that we don't want to take away something that's been important to people's identity, but you need to remember what is it you see as your identity, and then try to define that and help us use that.
And we agree entirely with that point of view, Kathy, when we devised the criteria for ICD-11, that we felt, based very largely on your research, of course, but there was no justification for having a separate diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome.
Another question that we had in is really getting to something that we'd sort of touched on briefly before, is the issue of the new diagnosis of social communication disorder, and whether or not people are being misdiagnosed as having SCD rather than as having autism.
Well, I think that is a case, that is an open question. And I think we really have to follow that, as people either use that diagnosis or don't use that diagnosis. And I think actually David should comment what will happen with ICD-11. For DSM-5, our concern was that, most of us on the committee were autism experts. And so, at least from my experience, I very rarely see kids who don't have some kind of repetitive behavior. But mostly I work in an autism clinic. And so people come to see me because they think the child has autism. And in fact, not always. I mean, it certainly isn't the case that everyone who comes here has autism, but that's what I'm looking for. And so mostly I do find something. But, we also had a core group of people, including speech pathologists, who said, no, there are children out there and adults who have social communication deficits like those that occur in people with autism and don't have any repetitive behaviors. And they will have no diagnosis and they will have no way to get services in a US health system if you take away PDD-NOS. And so that was our concern. Mm-hmm. If we look at the data that we have for kids who came through autism clinics and didn't get autism diagnoses, then we found very few kids who didn't have any repetitive behaviors. I mean, that was who met social communication criteria. So we really didn't have a lot of evidence for an existence of such a group. Since that time, there have been a couple research papers that have shown maybe some evidence of those kids. So we don't know. But I think the concern of our committee was the way the American health system worked, we did not want to have a group of people that would be left without any way of describing their difficulties within the US health system. And Sally, you should add.
No, that's absolutely true in terms of what the process was. And I think, the number of children with and adults with the PDD-NOS diagnosis at the time we were doing this was huge.
Right.
It was used all the time. And in some clinics, it was used far more than ASD, what Kathy was talking about. There were some clinics that in Kathy's study in which nobody got an autism diagnosis. Maybe one child got an autism diagnosis and everybody else got a PDD-NOS diagnosis. And when you compared those children to another clinic where they made no PDD-NOS diagnoses and everybody had ASD, there was nothing different about the children. And so that lets you know that there were some clinicians who were far more comfortable with using a PDD-NOS diagnosis for the same group of children that others of us saw as ASD. And so we had to find a way to make sure that people who had this PDD-NOS diagnosis could be somewhere and could get services. Another group of children at the time that this was being discussed, we thought it would apply, were very young children. At the time, we thought the repetitive behaviors came on a little bit later in the evolution of the symptoms of autism, and that very early on the clearest symptoms were the social reciprocity symptoms. And so at the time we were thinking about this, we also realized that there may be some young children who would start with the social communication problems, and then if they evolved into also having repetitive behaviors, they would move diagnoses. There were also other categories being used. People were using nonverbal learning disabilities to include children with social deficits. People were using semantic pragmatic language disorder to capture these same children. And so we agreed that there needed to be a classification and one diagnosis instead of multiple to capture people who had mostly the difficulty of the social interaction, social responsivity characteristics.
But I think just to go back to the very first question, what I would say to families is if you have had a very brief diagnostic interview, if you have seen a physician or a psychologist for a 20-minute visit or even a 45-minute visit, but mostly you have had a very brief interaction where someone has spent very little time with, you feel like interviewing you or looking at your child, and they give you a social communication disorder diagnosis, and you feel that is not correct, then you should get another diagnostic assessment, because I think that sometimes people just don't have enough information about repetitive behaviors. And I can tell you that one time I saw a child where I felt like I had done everything under the sun, and I could not find any evidence of a repetitive behavior. And I said to the parents, you know, look, I can't find any evidence of a repetitive behavior. I think I'm going to have to say your child has a social communication disorder, although I really think this child has autism, but you just haven't told me anything, I haven't seen anything. And then literally during the feedback, I got out a spoon, and they were like, oh no, no spoons, no spoons, no spoons. You know, we can't have spoons. I was like, what do you mean you can't have spoons? And they're like, oh, wait till you see what he does with spoons. Yeah, spoons. You know, I was like, what do you, I mean, literally, it then revealed this whole series of this child had all these repetitive behaviors. Somehow they hadn't told me, I hadn't asked them, and then out came this whole flood of repetitive behaviors that I just hadn't happened to ask. They hadn't told me. We had spoons, but he hadn't seen them. So I think that is the worry, you know, for all of us, that we just don't happen to hit upon the one little thing that shows us the repetitive behaviors. Or for girls, I think, as David said, you know, we're all focused on flags and Thomas the Tank Engine, when in fact the child is focused on tiaras and Frozen or something, and we don't have the right stuff.
Yeah.
So I think we do need to be very, very careful.
And I think that the emphasis on those repetitive behaviors may make it more difficult to detect those behaviors in the higher functioning, as it were, higher IQ children.
Yeah.
And the emphasis we've placed in ICD-11 more on adaptive functioning in terms of flexibility may pick those kids up. So I think you're absolutely right, Kathy, that there are a lot of children who appear to have some sort of social communication disorder because you haven't asked the right questions about their cognitive flexibility and maybe some degrees of repetitive behavior which have eluded your diagnostic questioning. But also, I think that we decided that it would make more sense for the children who have a language problem, primarily a pragmatic language disorder, to be diagnosed as having a developmental language disorder. So the way we handled this in ICD-11 is to perhaps what you call social communication disorder under the heading of a pragmatic language disorder as part of a number of developmental language disorders, and separate out autism spectrum disorder.
Yeah, and that is sort of where it goes in DSM-5. It's just that DSM is a psychiatric manual, so it's in neurodevelopmental disorders in the communication disorder section, but not under autism spectrum disorder. It's under speech and language disorder. Mm-hmm. So, but it's, I think none of us is sure that we did the right thing, for us.
This also gets to another question that we had, and maybe we can sort of finish with this, is what are the key questions that still need to be addressed? Because you spoke earlier about how there were gaps in the evidence that informed this current diagnostic criteria. So what is left unanswered and still has to be?
I think that we need to keep going to get more information about what can we do better. I mean, I think as David said, I think ICD-11 will help, but more information about girls and women and adult diagnoses. I mean, predominantly first adult diagnoses of people with average intelligence. I don't think we've got good enough information to do that in DSM-5. I don't know, you guys, what else?
Well, I think the issue of getting younger and younger is a real challenge. Kathy pointed out a minute ago that we don't know how to diagnose autism in babies. And there are also the symptoms that you would think of and that we come up on the AOC, for instance, the Autism Observation Scale for infants, are symptoms that occur in other infants, as well as in infants who have a genetic risk for autism, let's say. Difficult eye contact or challenges, babies who are neutral in expression, babies who are not so responsive to their mothers. Those occur in various kinds of situations, including babies who have an intellectual, or who will eventually have an intellectual delay, but currently have a significant developmental delay and haven't grown into those behaviors yet. So it's really a challenge, and parents who read the red flags, and so many young parents are so well informed right now about the autism risk. They're taking these red flags in infancy very seriously, and they're very worried about their babies at a time when we don't have much help for them other than to just support the symptoms that we see and the concerns that they have, and help them find the very best ways to interact with their babies until the baby is old enough to have symptoms kind of differentiate or clear up. But I think that's a real challenge that we've created around the focus, the important focus on early screening and early treatment, has this other side that is really causing so much concern for some families so early. And we don't have an answer for that right now.
And in terms of the symptom complexes that are associated with autism in DSM-5, there is the whole question of hypo and hypersensitivity, which was, I think, rightly introduced into DSM-5 and is certainly prominent in ICD-11 as well. But it is a domain of autistic symptomatology about which we know not very much. And that is a field ripe for further research and understanding of the neurophysiological underpinnings of those sensitivities, which are not well understood at the moment.
One other thing that that has come up in some of the questions, and we have a lot of questions that we haven't been able to get to, and I'll address that in a moment, was whether or not, in the future we'd be incorporating biomarkers into the diagnostic criteria too.
Maybe. I think they're pretty far right now from being useful. Because I think mostly the biomarkers are pretty far from biomarkers for autism. I mean, they're biomarkers for risk for something sort of related to autism is where I would see them. I don't know, you guys. What do you think, Sally or David?
Well, some of them haven't demonstrated their ability to predict autism from other developmental disorders. Yeah. So they're sensitive to differences, which are going to affect development, but they're not, my understanding is they're not sensitive to those children who might develop intellectual disability versus ADHD versus language disorder versus ASD, so that they're not necessarily telling us something about ASD.
Yeah.
Well, I would agree with that. And I think we just need to distinguish perhaps two different classes of biomarkers. So there are those biomarkers that aren't going to change your genetic makeup. And there are other biomarkers that may well change, which would be, for example, ERP responses to certain sorts of stimuli. And those might change during development for reasons that we don't understand. Maybe even issues like white matter tract functions and structures. Those might evolve over time as well. So I think we've got to be very careful when we're talking about making diagnoses from biomarkers. I'm of course not ruling out the possibility that in a few years' time they may help us differentiate people with different types of autism. I think Kathy pointed out right at the beginning, there is a plethora of different autism, which we're rather crudely lumping together under this, this heading autism spectrum disorders.
I mean, at the moment, autism is a set of behaviors, and a biomarker isn't telling us about behaviors. Biomarker is telling us about biology. And those two things may or may not come together in the end.
Mm.
Okay, I'm afraid that I'm going to have to stop this here. Thank you so much for such a interesting and full conversation. And just so that everybody knows, a complete replay of this roundtable will be available on the Spectrum News site in a couple of days. The roundtable is part of an ongoing webinar series, so check our site for upcoming talks to be announced soon and video archives of previous webinars. Next webinar is with Shivali Jest on April 25th, discussing biomarkers in high-risk infants. And as to everybody's questions that did not get asked or answered during this session, I will forward them on to the panelists so that they can be addressed at a later date. Okay, so thank you again, Kathy and Sally and David, and thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. Bye, you guys.
Bye.
Fun.